Good afternoon, honeys. Welcome back to the pod, Highbrow Honey. It turns out it might be true what they say about April showers. Even though today started off nice and beautiful, sunshiny, I was able to do some yoga out on my screened-in porch. It is now windy and cloudy and looking like it's going to storm at any moment. Though that would not be a problem today, I really hope it doesn't continue into tomorrow because playing rugby in the rain is fun, but it's definitely a lot tougher. Hopefully your weather's better than mine. Today we are doing one of our deep dive thematic episodes. As you probably saw from the title here, we're looking at critics in the 19th century and what exactly their impacts were before critics evolved into what they are today. We're looking backwards to see what they were then. And I don't think we need any more of a lead-in than that, so here we go, satellite radio. To be honest with you, honeys, though I am academically scarred and do feel the need to cite my sources, I have found that it takes up a little too much time in this episode. So I'm going to just remind you that you can look at that source doc via the link available in the episode description. I promise you I got this information from reliable sources, especially since a good chunk of these sources came straight out of one of my grad school lectures. Obviously, we are looking at one particular role in the art world here in this episode, what the critic does, how they impact social views in general, and how they influence the development of the history of art. So what precisely is an art critic? They're a person whose goal is to observe and reflect upon the aesthetics, the concepts, and or the context of a given artwork in order to form a well thought out opinion or conclusion about it. This is an important step in sharing and understanding art because going through the process of criticizing a piece allows one to raise dialogues surrounding it, questions about it, and so on. Critics trained in art and art history are especially important because, as Natasha Antone says in her argument defending the critic in today's world, quote, art criticism can take the techniques, materials, or aesthetics of an artwork or exhibition and parallel it to greater discussions such as politics, race, religion, or gender, end quote. She later says, quote, what art criticism does is explore our society through the lens of creators, but rather than accept blindly, critics encourage skepticism, critical thought, and discourse, end quote. Sometimes, critics and their relationships to certain artists can even inspire an entirely new technique, an artistic philosophy, or even an artistic movement. Some examples that are now legitimate canonical examples include Fauvism and Impressionism themselves. There's a long record to prove that they have affected the arts in exactly these ways. Remember, for example, that the critics are the ones who inspired society at large to drive Sargent and Madame Gautreau from France over the scandal of the Madame X portrait. The Madame X portrait is not a singular example, however. There are many others of moral pushback from critics towards works of art or the messages that they send across art history, but these debates particularly were strong and included society at large in the 19th century, which is why we're going to focus in on that specific era. So what did it look like in practice for these critics to be the sort of artistic morality police? Well, Victorian-era critics supported the strict codes of morality and ideology dominating the time through the gauge of sentiment in the artwork, and sentiment as it meant in that time. It is hard to nail down exactly what it meant. It was very complex, amorphous, often more synonymous with poetic. At least, this is the argument of Julie Codell in her article Sentiment in Art. She says that this idea of sentiment, quote, encompassed connotations of moral values, social propriety, mere sentimentality, and the highest human sympathy, as well as incorporating a social function to elicit sympathy from the viewer through an appropriate expression of strong feeling stirred by accurate visual detail, end quote. Basically, this criticism reinforced the status quo morality by encouraging empathy and gentleness as proofs of civility. Says Codell, quote, the rules of emotion which structure these roles are rules of appraisal, or the ways that an emotion is organized and expressed, and the rules of prognosis, the appropriate time for an emotion to run its course, end quote. What Codell is arguing is that criticism happens entirely within the context of moral exercises in the 19th century. In other words, the trend of criticism, as well as art, begins moving towards using everyday figures in highly emotional contexts in order to prescribe appropriate behavior. These moral behavior codes are very much a result of their era and tied to the bunk sciences of the 19th century, and are meant to maintain biased social hierarchies, think here of maybe phrenology, as well as to combat the rising blurring of classes via dress. This is basically meant to be another classification, ordering social hierarchy system. Codell makes several very strong points about this, saying at one point, quote, emotions in Descartes' context of higher emotions, aka sentiment, are intentional and cognitive, and their identification always incorporates the local moral order, i.e., the system of rights, obligations, duties, and conventions of evaluation, end quote. She additionally notes that quote-unquote genuine emotion measurements critics made were in truth the means of classing the characters and literally teaching quote-unquote proper feelings as well as interaction norms with the art itself. Critics at this time stressed keeping a very specific status quo of decorum. As Codell puts it, the formula here is sentiment plus decorum plus social order equals discursive formation for critical reception. This equation translates to the idea that reality is more often presented in 19th century artworks as sentiment, which is formative. It teaches what emotion is appropriate in what circumstance. It even teaches to what depth an emotion can be felt. Codell says, quote, in its pejorative implications, emotion is usually condemned when it is excessive or when it is absent, signifying estrangement and alienation, end quote. She goes on to say, quote, for the Victorians, sentiments were moral and idealized. Artists and critics served to naturalize and ideologize the correct feelings in their appropriate situations, end quote. For example, the appropriateness of the level of grief was gauged by artists and critics in two senses: their beauty and the intensity of their emotions. In fact, Codell points out a failure to do this. Quote, the early paintings of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were soundly condemned for their aesthetic of intensity displayed in figures of abrasive gawkiness and unlovely faces which foiled their spectators' identification and empathy, end quote. The author even says that this affected larger scale arts interactions, events, places of viewing as well. Quote, art museums and exhibitions became public property with a new social role. to manage the heart and bring it in line with social mores and cultural ambitions. The critic directed socialization through empathy and identification." End quote. Now that we've covered where the Victorian lines of morality in art, were laid and by whom, the critics, we can circle back to other specific examples of works or movements that received moral pushback from the critics of the day. A first example we can look to is Simeon Solomon's relationship to the Pre-Raphaelites. Though an artist himself, he was quite critical of their works and quite public about it. The iconography of the masculinity of the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhoods' figures came into question because of their return to classical and mythological subjects depicted in unusual ways. They also depicted priests and gods with a lowercase g, but not God with a uppercase g. Solomon was not alone in asking these questions, however. Others, such as Swinburne and Pater, were also questioning the masculinity and manhood shown in these artworks. The critics tried to find ways to squeeze these depictions, which were a little on the homosocial side, into the existing lines of Victorian morality. In order to do so, they came up with a new concept, Pater did specifically, that of the aesthete, who enjoys spectacles of male beauty and may be unusually able to discern subtle masculinities. They define this new type as aesthetically conscious and precious to artists. Pater himself notes important foundations of his ideas from those of the earlier critic Winckelmann, but uses this particular aesthete's type, high cultural precedents, aka Greco-Roman sculptural norms, in order to indicate its slightly revolutionary nature. Yet we still see moral confines on expression and emotion here. 19th century critics separated expression in order to separate the appropriate from the inappropriate. This meant that facial expressions, in particular ambiguity, became a skill in the artist's repertoire. It was a combination of work and manner which created the expression in order to unite artist and critic through the resulting outward form of the figure. I can't stress enough, though, that the ambiguity was what allowed, supposedly, the creator and the receiver to connect, which is a very different stance than the majority of those taken throughout art history. In James Smalls's article, Slavery is a Woman, he discusses the critical reception of Marie Benoit's Portrait d'une Negresse from 1800. The essay illuminates the ties between visual codes of morality through the example of that particular image. Smalls says, quote, "For such critics, as well as for some lay observers, the negative shock of blackness, the tache as a visible sign and symbol of ugliness and horror, was set in contrastive association with the virtuous attributes of white female purity and beauty." End quote. The portrait in question features a seated black woman shown in three-quarter profile with a white dress that has fallen below her right breast and a white hair covering on her head. Benoit broke with the visual laws of morality at the time by presenting a black woman and a portrait that was of equal standing to a white woman's portrait. It is relatively dignified and shows the woman with some emotion, but also quite a bit of internal fortitude. She is shown as beautiful. And of course, for those reasons, it got crap because people didn't get it and it was outside of the status quo. Says Smalls, quote, male critics of the period asserted condescendingly that Benoit's brand of neoclassicism was laced with the quote-unquote feminine traits of delicacy and sensuality assigned to the Rococo and to its practitioners, end quote. Some only focused on the stylistic comparisons between this figure and David without any reference to the feminist or racial subject matter. Very small clarification, qualification point here. I do not agree with any of the racist commentary, critical statements, nothing like that. That is unfortunately the reality of what was believed and published at that time. And unfortunately, because as I discussed in the Madam X episode, Victorians really believed that any external symptoms were a result of an internal moral disease. Not only was very pale or jaundiced skin considered a sign of moral ineptitude as well as physical illness, unfortunately, blackness was also considered the same way. The racial motivations behind the moral unacceptance of this portrait raised not only the question of what subjects are worthy of representation, but, as Smalls puts it, quote, more specifically, what subjects were appropriate for white women artists of high social standing to engage, end quote. So we do see the moral pushback for both sides here, not only what she produced, but the further moral limitations on Benoit as a female artist at this time. And in some ways, that was exactly her point, to present a challenge to the critics who had come up with ways to claim that her and her work, her subjects, were immoral in the past. There are many, many further examples of art critics having major impacts on art history, but as we only have so much time, let's go for a pretty infamous one. The reception of Manet's Olympia and what exactly it taught us about the 19th century critic, their power, and their preferences. Manet's 1865 Olympia received a ton of criticism when it was revealed for the first time to the public in the 1865 Salon. Several of the most prominent critical complaints centered on a couple of things to do with the woman herself as well as how she was presented. First of all, she was not an ethereal, perfect female subject. A lot of the moral critical blowback upon its first public viewing in the Salon centered on how this woman figure broke with precedents not only of beauty standards of, past woman figures, but also how realistically she is depicted as a human being and as a self-possessed one at that. This Olympia, like her precedents of lounging women figures in art historical past, is completely nude. She goes ahead and poses somewhat seductively. She's got an arm placed kind of to hide her crotch. However, her hair is not spilling out seductively around her shoulders. Her curvature is not in line with classical standards of beauty, and her gaze is relatively very confrontational. She looks directly back at the viewer with this gaze that has no apology in it or no invitation based on the fact of her nudity. This direct return of the viewer's stare is a challenge to how women have been presented as submissive in this particular sort of image in the past. The fact that she is, through various symbology, identified as a sex worker made this painting all the more scandalous and morally outrageous because it put a woman of, such low social standing into the same class as some of the art historical models of the past by representing her in a very similar manner. In doing so, he puts Olympia on the same level as these past precedents. Not only was class an issue here, however, race was as well. The painting features a black woman, presumably a maid, presenting Olympia with a bouquet of flowers. And these flowers are widely presumed to be one of those symbols of her courtesanship. They're presumed to be a gift from a lover. The figure of the black maid is especially important because it too breaks with past traditions of the maid in this situation, presenting something to a lounging woman who is the spectacle of beauty. In every past rendition, at least that I know of, that maid has been white. And so Manet's choice to present this maid as a black woman forces viewers to acknowledge the social reality of France at that time. It also brings up the racial prejudices and racially based hierarchies of French society at the time by, of course, bringing up this outrage through that change in the figure's ethnicity. But Olympia's head is at the same level as her maid's, thus putting them on slightly equal ground. The figure of the maid is also depicted very naturalistically. She doesn't have any cartoonish, racially exaggerated features. Of course, with all of these moral transgressions, from making the star figure a sex worker to including a black woman and beyond, the critics went crazy over this one. They completely denounced it, made fun of it, called it terrible, vulgar, inappropriate, just threw the book at Manet for this one. In DJ Getsy's article on Teaching Olympia, he details how critics seized upon the juxtaposition of the two bodies, Olympia and her attendant, in order to unfavorably compare the two, relating them to racially scripted differences and using those to basically challenge the validity of the work and the nude figure presented. She cites a caricature of the work made by an artist and critic of the last name Bertrand. In his caricature, he assigns a class to his protagonist through the title of Laborer's Wife. However, he also draws the figures as especially masculine. The point of this image is to make those who hadn't seen Manet's original believe that the women in the painting weren't women at all. And that's because of the supposed masculinity in Olympia's imperfect body and in her direct gaze. Bertrand, of course, did not leave his criticisms solely to the visual. As Getsy says, quote, "The feminization of Manet's name for the reclining figure indicates how his ridicule was grounded in and visualized as the masculinity, or at least non-femininity, of Olympia, coupled with the further dehumanization and degendering of the attendant," end quote. In other words, these critical reactions revealed how sex workers in self-possessed positions, especially while nude, as well as lower-class black female subjects, were considered lesser and unworthy simply based on such demographics. Thankfully, though, several of his younger colleagues, his more unconventional and what would become modern-minded friends, really appreciated what he did here in terms of rejecting the norms. And of course, because irony is the gift that keeps on giving, all this made that painting famous. We probably would still study it in art history anyway for the, sake of learning about Impressionism, but we learn mostly about the controversy in this huge moment of Western cultural shifts, and it's all thanks to the uproar. Nice job, critics. Manet, especially with this image, had a long and diverse impact on art history, but he certainly received more than his fair share of flack for it when it was first presented. I have also hinted repeatedly at the intensity of relationships between artists and some art critics of those days. Well, here is where we get to circle back to the article that I did not want to name because I wanted to have a little surprise for you all at the end here. Let's talk about the time Manet dueled a critic. The craziest part of this story is that actually Manet and the critic in question were really good friends up until this incident. According to a Hyperallergic December 2023 article, the novelist Émile Zola wrote down the story of this duel after witnessing it firsthand between Manet and Durante. Zola's handwritten account of the incident was expected to fetch up to $7,500 in an online Christie's sale that closed December 15th, hence the article's timing. Says Christie's head of books and manuscripts in London, Thomas Venning, this description allows one a better peek into the frenemy-loaded French artistic environment at that time. It allows one to, through a first-hand account of the incident, experience what cultural life was like. The story of the duel goes a little like this. The relationship between the friends had become really tense because Durante published a very lukewarm review of Manet's Beggar with Oysters Philosopher from 1865 to 1867 as part of his own growing frustration with two things. First, Manet's refusal to publicly get on the realism train, which was one that the critic thought extremely highly of. And secondly, Manet continued to enter and compete to win in the salons, wanting that sort of validation. Durante thought this was especially lame of him. Manet, very concerned with these new dents in his public appearance, then reportedly went and publicly slapped the writer at the popular avant-garde spot, the Café Goubert, on February 22nd, 1870. Durante is like, fine, you want to go then? Let's go. And challenges Manet, on the spot to a duel the next morning in the Saint-Germain-en-Laye forest on the outskirts of Paris. Manet obviously chooses Zola to be his witness, and Zola later writes a dramatic yet formulaic in the sort of language he chooses. It aligns very closely to general duel descriptions at that time, account of what happened. What makes the incident so significant in art history is that it was largely outside of Zola's usual wheelhouse in terms of subject, style, the first-handedness, so on. That Zola decided to give such a detailed and yet formulaic description of the incident tells us that it really was impactful to him as a person on the French art scene, that it clearly mattered in the opinions of their peers, Durante and Manet's, I mean. Also, in case you were wondering, it does not appear that anybody died in this duel. In fact, it doesn't appear to be a big deal to anybody involved at all. Hyperallergic says, quote, according to Zola's testimony, signed by the duel's other observers, the 11 a.m. fight entailed a single engagement of violence resulting in 2 bent swords. Durante sustained a small injury on the right side of his chest after Manet's weapon slipped on a rib. End quote. Zola goes on to say, quote, in the face of this wound, the witnesses declared that honor was satisfied and there was no need to continue the fight. End quote. They handled it much like rugby players, actually, where they presumably went and got a beer afterwards and just kept on being friends. According to Hyperallergic, they remained so until Durante's death in 1880. So let's summarize and catch back up to the present. Critics were really important then, as the people who thought critically on behalf of a lot of society about what an artwork is saying, whether that statement is reasonable or accurate or meaningful. They can also show, by representing specific and often academic viewpoints, what differences exist between what people think defines culture at any given moment. They can act as keepers of the status quo, as they did in the 19th century, or else they can encourage radical new avenues, as they did in the 20th century. In the 21st century, their role is less clear. There's some question of whether critics still matter in the contemporary art scene, or even should they. Forbes quotes director Samuel Keller of Art Basel as saying, quote, when I entered the art world, famous critics had an aura of power. Now they're more like philosophers, respected, but not as powerful as collectors, dealers, or curators. Nobody fears critics anymore, which is a real danger sign for the profession, end quote. This is because, as the Forbes article author states, quote, the art world, like any organism, requires a certain amount of pruning to stay healthy, so the disempowerment of critics, our putative pruners, should cause concern, end quote. I couldn't find a specific author's name anywhere on this article, but they conclude that critics of today are too afraid to be negative. On the other hand, no review means anything significant if all of them are positive. So what circumstances have changed that have disempowered critics so much? First of all, the internet, of course. As Darren Jones writes in a Mutual Art magazine article discussing why art criticism does or does not still matter, he writes, quote, while there remains a critical hierarchical structure that distinguishes prestige, or the lack thereof, between titles, increasingly it seems that artists are concerned with just getting mentioned somewhere, anywhere, as they are with what is actually said about the work. A remark, a sentence, or a full-throated inspection may have a superficial equality of currency when it comes to dissemination online. In other words, he believes he is observing a trend wherein artists care much more about getting name dropped than they do about the quality of any criticism associated with that name drop. This is a problem because it leaves very few opportunities for an artist to receive constructive feedback instead. The monetary value of criticism has decreased right along with it. Jones points out, quote, even the swankiest art publications, such as Art Forum, Frieze, and Art in America, only pay $100 to $150 per freelance review, end quote. This makes even regularly featured critics like Sarah Valdez, whose writings have appeared in Art in America, feel relatively powerless in their positions. Even the status associated with the title of art critic has decreased. Once considered a profession in and of itself, art criticism is becoming more and more considered a stepping stone to more lucrative and stable opportunities such as art consulting, art dealing, or academia. Now, rather than being the source of news on the latest developments in Western art critics are often the last to the party. I know this is a hard argument to make when I've just spent an entire episode explaining how critics can do more harm than good, especially through moralizing and other such biased actions. But I don't do the easy thing, so later in the Forbes article, they state, quote, "For centuries, criticism functioned as the rough draft of art history, drubbing out bad work while championing the innovative and accomplished. Yet today we have no Clement Greenberg laying down the law on modernism, or Pierre Restani defining new realism," end quote. His point is that it makes it harder for everyone, really, to understand who and what work could be significant to the historical record, who is producing profound work that really encapsulates something about the human experience at a given time. The shift of power towards curators is dangerous for them as well, actually. It adds on to their workload, it raises their power and status, but the danger about that is that curators, being those who develop conversations with artists about their work and choose who to present when, they're necessarily closer to artists and thus subjective, whereas critics are unattached entirely and more able to provide objective analyses. At least, that used to be the case. Critics are increasingly becoming wedged into this rock and hard place situation of professional entanglements. Many must do short-term business with galleries, but because future work is becoming increasingly scarce, they are somewhat limited in their ability to provide any criticism, much less constructive, for fear of jeopardizing future opportunities. All in all, it points to a concerning, larger trend of passive artistic consuming and lack of critical thinking surrounding art and artworks. Granted, there are some problems coming from the writing styles of art critics themselves. Their reviews tend to be very dry, technical, and these days, a big problem is that too much of it is descriptive or about the context of the work and not focusing on the art itself, the technical capability or the effective use of color, shadowing, depth, whatever the technique may be. Such trends are not helped by the existence of faraway fairs that come with seasonal trend updates, which are available via gallery website press releases. Being able to easily flip through images of curators' top choices from various fairs and whatnot make art a very quick and easy thing to look at, which undermines the purpose of sitting with it, appreciating whatever it is that makes that work meaningful. Instead, we just see it as valuable because somebody in the art world decided to repost it. I think a good summary of where we, as well as the art critic, is at is summarized in this Forbes article in a short anecdote. One major New York gallery dealer recounted to them having received congratulatory calls for a great review for weeks from various people, none of whom apparently realized that the critic was actually slamming the artist on show in that review. They simply saw the review existed, not its opinion factor, and that was good enough for them to endorse work they hadn't even seen. These are the concerns that those who have learned to value art criticism have about its potential disappearance and its current devaluation. All right, honeys, That is the Critic, the 19th century, a hint of the 20th, and today in the 21st. I hope you've enjoyed our breakdown of tales here that give you a sense of what all it was like for the art critic then and their relationships with the artists, what exactly their motives were, so on. I will talk to you all Tuesday with our new release of The Business. In the meantime, have a lovely weekend. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.